Good afternoon and welcome to the Norma Lytton Program for Education from the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut. I am Linda Friedlaender, Head of Education at the Center. Generous support for this program has been established in memory of Norma Lytton by her family. Norma was an active docent for over 20 years and subsequently spent a decade engaged in research for the Center's Department of Painting and Sculpture. Today's panel discussion will address the question, what is inclusive design? Three core members of MIXdesign will discuss why designing architectural spaces that are accessible and appropriate for all people is an exercise in inclusive design and an acknowledgement of basic human rights. MIXdesign is a New York-based think tank and consultancy that is dedicated to transforming everyday building types, such as restrooms, workspaces, schools, and museums, into accessible spaces that accommodate people of all ages, genders, races, religions, and abilities. By carefully considering the needs of individuals long overlooked by architects, interior designers, and clients, MIXdesign embraces the power of buildings to influence the ways people encounter and move through them, and their potential to provide socialization, learning, shelter, and employment. Hansel Bauman is human-centered design specialist at MIXdesign and founder and principal of HS/A+P. Bauman served as adjunct faculty and campus architect for Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., the only liberal arts university fully dedicated to serving deaf and hard of hearing students. There, he led the development of the Deaf Space Design Guidelines, a catalog of more than 100 architectural principles attuned to deaf spatial sensibilities. Magda Mostafa is an academic, advocate, and practicing architect. She is an associate professor of design and autism design consultant at Progressive Architects, as well as the autism design lead at MIXdesign, co-directing these efforts with her colleague, Dr. Linda Friedlaender, where they work to bring the lens of neurodiversity and autism to the intersectional work of this think tank and design consultancy. Magda is the author of the Autism Aspect Design Index, the world's first research-based design framework for designing for autism, and the author of the recently published Autism-Friendly University Design Guide. Joel Sanders is director of MIXdesign, which he founded in 2018 as a branch of his New York-based studio, JSA. The design firm is an NGLCC certified LGBT business enterprise. JSA projects have been featured in international exhibitions and the permanent collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Sanders is also former director of post-professional studies and professor in the practice at the Yale School of Architecture. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather questions, and we will attempt to answer them at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. And finally, Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Western Pequot, Shagakuk, Gold Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect these people and nations and this land. And now, what is inclusive design?
Thank you, Linda, for that introduction. Linda, I want to thank you for two reasons. Linda and I met 4 years ago at a lunchtime talk that I gave at the esteemed museum at the Center for British Art. Not only did Linda invite our group to give this talk, which is a great honor, but Linda introduced us to her daughter, Erin Friedlaender, and for that we are forever grateful. Erin is a graduate of Yale and an esteemed physician and university professor of pediatric emergency medicine at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And it was Linda who introduced me to Erin, who subsequently joined MIX as one of our core team experts. Erin is a very, very networked person in the Yale tradition, and in turn recruited Magda, who's with us today. So Linda, in the end, we owe it to you for helping us really found the community of MIX that we are today. So thank you. Next. Let us begin by briefly introducing you to MIX. And MIX is a branch of our studio based in New York, which is an architecture studio. Next. And we specialize in doing work at universities, as well as art museums. In fact, we were involved in the interior renovation of both phases of the Yale University Art Gallery. Next. Okay, but in 2018, we established a new branch of JSA, MIXdesign, and MIX is a think tank and a design consultancy. As Linda already said, we consider the broad needs of a segment of the population that the discipline of architecture has traditionally overlooked. And by that, I mean marginalized people, people of different intersecting ages, genders, races, religions, and abilities that fall out of the cultural mainstream and fall out of the purview of architecture. Next. So since antiquity, architects have designed buildings based on studying and even measuring the characteristics of two kinds of bodies. Leonardo's Vitruvian Man and the Anthropometrics on the right by Henry Dreyfuss are examples of architects who have studied ideal bodies, those whose perfect proportions we mortals can only aspire to. But beginning in the 19th century, architects influenced by science and medicine began to use scientific instruments and practices to record the dimensions and the characteristics of the so-called normal body. Both the ideal body, depicted on the left, and the normal body, depicted on the right, were in both cases assumed to be white, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual, and male. And these anthropometric data has been the basis of design standards that are encoded in the textbooks, architectural guidelines, and regulatory codes that are still in use to this day, and that in fact are on every desk of my students at the Yale School of Architecture, a few hundred feet away from the British Art Building. Next. However, this purportedly objective scientific data has been used to differentiate so-called normal from so-called abnormal bodies. Next. At different moments in American history, as well as world history, including our own, it has been used to justify discriminatory policies, determining who has access to and who is excluded from public space. And these would include women, people of color, immigrants, and the disabled, based on the erroneous assumption that these populations somehow possess innate physical, mental, or moral defects that render them unfit to enter the public realm. Next. So at MIX, we're dedicated to combating our discipline's complicity in reinforcing racism, heteronormativity, and ableism. And we work with progressive clients to apply inclusive design approaches, which will be the subject of our talk today, to develop tools that take the form of recommendations, guidelines, and prototypes for making everyday building types safe and accessible for a wide spectrum of people. And our work is based on a series of design principles which build upon but differentiate ourselves from the very important foundation laid by ADA, the American for Disability Act, passed in 1990, as well as the movement often referred to as universal design. So first, we are intersectional. Rather than narrowly focus on people with physical or sensory disabilities alone, we consider the needs of a broader spectrum of the population that are illustrated in this Venn diagram. Our intersectional approach is based on the conviction that human experience and embodied identities are constituted by a variety of intersecting factors. And so for this reason, we consider the relationships between disability, people with mobility, sensory, and neurodiversity challenges. We think about gender, including women, trans, non-binary folk. And we think about culture, spatial practices associated with religion and race. Next. And we offer an alternative to the separate but equal model that's characteristic of most accessibility standards, including the ADA. They tend to prescribe physical accommodations like separate ramps and entrances, which are well-meaning, but which unintentionally segregate and as a consequence stigmatize those people referred to as people with special needs. In addition, many disabilities that aren't immediately visible, okay, like deafness, neurodiversity, autism, have been overlooked by accessibility codes that again tend to focus on mobility challenges. Next. So we've developed a three-step, what we call inclusive design methodology, represented in this diagram. And what's important is it's designed to foster sharing among individuals, families, friends, cohorts, and caregivers, while providing options for people with unique functional and privacy needs. So our process is illustrated on the left. For example, this is a diagram that talks about how we work with museums. That will be a subject of our talk today. First, on the left, we analyze the needs of a diverse list of, in this case, museum visitors, right? As they are engaged in for activities typical to a museum, like entering, reception, rest, and wellness. And we think about those activities, how they're performed as individuals, groups, and even special events. Then, after doing this research about each sector, we conduct a comparative analysis of overlapping and even conflicting needs of end users and activities. And finally, in step 3, the outcome is a matrix of shared design strategies that guide how we work with clients to specify materials and finish choices, to come up with wayfinding, as well as lighting and even the specification of furniture and fixtures. And so our goal is to allow the maximum number of differently embodied and identified people to interact in different settings, okay? However, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions, and we also think about the unique needs of special communities. But we're, in a nutshell, we believe and promote and foster mixing, hence our name of our firm, MIXdesign. Next. So since establishing MIX in 2015, we've embarked on basically 3 initiatives that focus on 3 building types. We began with restrooms, and our first initiative, Stalled, was launched in response to national culture wars or debates around transgender access to public restrooms that took the traditional men's and women's room for granted. We instead have come up with an alternative prototype, the multi-user solution, and we've changed the International Building Code to make it code compliant. And we've shared our restroom expertise with institutions like Yale, Gallaudet University, Princeton, MIT, and Carnegie Mellon in a variety of ways. We help them to design and implement the multi-user prototype that we've developed. This illustrated here is the recently opened facility at Gallaudet. And we also even help universities come up with alternative design guidelines, okay? But in a nutshell, just this shows how we call ourselves binary abolitionists, okay? And what we mean by that is that we're opposed to spaces like restrooms that sort people based on two erroneous categories, men and women, and instead we're interested in creating inclusive spaces where a wide variety of people of different ages, genders, abilities, religions, what have you, can do that together, right? In this restroom, it features one open space, communal washing and grooming, and full height privacy stalls. And if you're interested in that work, we have a whole website, open source website, where you can learn more about that work. Next. However, in today's talk, we're going to focus on issues, not projects. However, in the process of sharing with you two high-level issues, we are going to talk about two issues, multisensory wayfinding and participatory design. But on the way, we're going to refer to examples of two other building types that we are involved with in our work, university campuses and art museums. Next.
Thank you, Joel. Moving on next, Lee. MIX has taken on the challenge of designing equitable post-pandemic public spaces. You know, even as the impacts of COVID seem to be subsiding, we retain the belief that the pandemic has and will irrevocably change the design of the built environment, much in the same way that the aftermath of 9/11 changed the way that we think about public and building security. The results, we believe, will be a higher standard of health and hygiene in both public and private buildings. We've been collaborating with a team from the public health experts from Yale Public Health and from the Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania to generate space planning principles that address one of the fundamental challenges posed by COVID. And that is this very delicate balance between balancing the need for individuals to engage one another and to engage with the built environment, while at the same time considering the basic public health imperative to restrict individuals from having physical contact with other individuals, or what has now become popularly known as social distancing. And then finally, from also preventing the touching of contaminated surfaces in the built environment. Next, please. I'm sure we all can easily recall the stress we felt in navigating public spaces during the pandemic. You know, just because of the necessary changes in conduct brought on by COVID, all of us, be we able-bodied or disabled bodies of all types of experiences, suddenly we felt a misfit with the space we once knew, or rather, we all, to some extent, became what we refer to here at MIX as non-compliant bodies. Those bodies that are hyper aware of and often anxious about how we maneuver within public space, how we maneuver safely within a once familiar space, which is now a disabling space. We believe that in order for people to feel free but connected, they need to feel a public space designed to minimize environmental stressors. And we see those environmental stressors having basically 2 points of origin. One is disorientation, the confusing spaces that lead to unintended contacts with people and building surfaces, and then also overstimulation that is triggered by noise, light, and even crowd activity. Reducing environmental stressors largely depends on spatial awareness. That is, providing sensory cues that make people aware of not only the presence and activities of others, and especially in unfamiliar places, but also providing really legible and instinctual cues as to points of destination and paths of movement versus those areas of gathering. Next, please. So we're learning about sensory cues that combat environmental stressors largely by drawing from the lived experience of 3 marginalized communities. And they, for the purposes of this exercise, we're focusing on wheelchair users, deaf people, and people who are on the autism spectrum. Each end user group that we've selected for this analysis has developed novel behavioral and design strategies for fostering spatial awareness to fit their own unique needs and that we believe are applicable to the general public at large. Our objective moving forward really simply is to apply the lessons learned from these marginalized groups, or as we say, learning from the margins, to generate inclusive COVID-19 design principles effective long after the pandemic subsides. And these principles would not only meet the needs of these three cohorts, but also the general public based around a common denominator that we all share, which is that need for sensory cues that increase our spatial awareness of the spaces around us. Next slide. So to kind of explain a little bit more about what that means, Magda and I want to kind of walk through, just give you an overview of three of those lenses and what their implications are within the built environment. First, unfortunately, we're not joined today by one of our comrades, QML Arroyo, who is Chief Accessibility Officer of the New York Department of Transportation, and he himself, a wheelchair user, has represented in this project the needs of people who have mobility issues, and including those of wheelchair users, those who use walkers and other assisted devices like canes and the like, who require unobstructed paths of travel that are easily maneuvered and without obstructions. Q recommends smooth pathways of travel, ideally wide enough for pairs of wheelchairs to pass kind of in both directions. And then also to alleviate abrupt level changes, to use slip-free surfaces and avoid using materials like deep carpets and rough surfaces that impede movement. Q's also given us an awful lot of insights into the ways that making entryways and restrooms more sanitary for people who use assistive devices, which you'll hear about a little bit later. Next. A little bit of a focus on the second cohort of deaf experience and how deaf experience, what its implications are to physical space and the design of that physical space. And I want to kind of think about this or present it through the concept of deaf space. It's a concept that we've developed and in quite some detail at the Deaf Space project that I co-directed at Gallaudet University in partnership with Dr. Ben Bahan with the Deaf Studies program there. Deaf people communicate visually using sign languages and perceive space in 360 degrees, primarily through vision and touch, and also through a collectivist cultural practices where each individual is looking out for the others. For example, on the left image you see here, in conversations between deaf people while walking, participants simultaneously see where they're going and their companion signing through the saccadic eye movement. The three friends you see here participate in the conversation by sharing roles of the signer and that of what is referred to as the third person, or the one who is looking out for the safety of the group as they move along the sidewalk. Every day, deaf people modify their hearing-centered built environments to create space for clear communication and spatial awareness. These daily acts of cultural customization provide the insights of many of the different ways buildings and public spaces can be designed to take on that role of the third person, that is, to enable communication and enhance spatial awareness and belonging simply by making modifications to the environment. Next, please. So we've taken those lessons learned and codified them into guidelines that Linda had mentioned earlier. I'll just give you a quick summary of how they touch on three fundamental touch points between deaf experience and the built environment. The first group of guidelines is concerned with design for visual language. That focuses on spatial arrangements for clear sight lines and for other kind of ambient qualities, such as maintaining glare-free lighting and color contrast to reduce eye strain, and to allow face-to-face views between signers of all signers and all participants, be they at motion or seated or at rest. The next group of guidelines looks at sensory reach, or rather design strategies to enable one to sense nearby activities in the presence of others by a number of novel strategies around reducing physical barriers that block sight lines, using well-placed translucent surfaces and reflective surfaces to literally allow deaf people to see around corners, and also taking into account things such as vibration, the way floors and walls or handrails might vibrate to give sensory cues, haptic cues of the movement of others. And also, surprisingly, for many people is the idea that acoustics is extremely important around creating a kind of ambient environment in which deaf people are able to use the degree of hearing that they do have to make out signal versus noise. And then finally, we pay close attention to cultural expression. The fact that spatial arrangements that encourage opportunities for casual face-to-face social interactions, along with design strategies and communication devices like the doorbell, visual doorbell you see diagrammed in the upper right-hand corner, to sustain social interaction within, again, what is known as a collectivist culture, that is the deaf culture. All these are ways of enabling a sense of inclusion and belonging that reinforce that cultural identity. Next. To the point of today's discussion around inclusive design and what we mean by that, the Deaf Space Guidelines, I'd like to share with you a little snippet of that process and how those guidelines were derived through over 10 years of what we call user-driven research and design projects. These are research projects that were not only they themselves designed by the users, implemented by the users, but then followed through with design activities that would act upon the lessons learned from research in creating ideas to modify the Gallaudet campus to make it more attuned to the deaf experience. In a moment, I want to share with you a video clip from our research project that focused on understanding the experience of deaf versus hearing experience of walking in public space. I think it'll give you a kind of sense of, fundamentally from the view of the user, how different life experiences can be. And then I'll share with you kind of an example of how we've acted on those insights. So Lee, if you'd take us to the next slide and start the video. People often ask me why there's no sound, and I sort of have to explain, well, this is a video for the deaf community, so no sound is necessary. What you see here is two individuals who are signers, deaf signers, walking on a retail street in Washington, D.C. We're recording with GoPro cameras, forehead mounted, to see how they see one another. And if you notice, they're always beholding the other in their views. It was rare that you didn't see the other face of your fellow interlocutor in view. Now, this is the hearing perspective. If you notice, you rarely see the one or either of the individuals. So there's a kind of different point of view. And these are critical kind of perspectives insofar as how we think about the attention paid to barriers in the street ahead. Often designed from this hearing perspective, we simply assume that barriers don't necessarily require any kind of forewarning or any kind of particular zoning or design consideration. Next slide, please, Lee. So learning from those lessons, we created two guidelines. You see a kind of diagrammed in the upper right-hand corner about the importance of rhythm in a building facade or interior circulation spaces, and that of the datum, a horizontal kind of guiding, kind of regulating line, if you will. And these could be, you could think of these as like picture rails or baseboards, which become visual cues, or quite literally visual hand-holding kind of armature for individuals who are walking along those surfaces, and keeping that rhythm is enabling this kind of measured understanding about where one is in space. And we found over time in the development of this guidelines that you see that was used on the base of the design of this dormitory building, this image you see here, as being a very effective design strategy, not only enabling distracted walkers or deaf individuals who might be faced on looking at one another, who would literally put that building background as the background to that view as the two individuals walk along that. But moreover, we're giving a really excellent kind of visual hand-holding, if you will, for deaf blind individuals or people with low vision, giving these kind of regulatory cues or regulating cues for people who have low vision to help them understand where they are in wayfinding. And with that focus on deaf space, I'll go to Magda, turn it over to you to begin to talk about the neurodiverse lens.
Thank you so much, Hansel. And I just want to reiterate Joel's thanks to Linda for catalyzing this series of serendipitous events that brought me to this wonderful group. I always tell Joel, Hansel, and Aaron that one of the hidden blessings of the COVID pandemic was the birth of this MIXdesign working group, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So thank you again, Linda. So thank you, Hansel, for running us through the deaf space perspective, which however many times I hear it is such a joy to listen to and learn more about. But I'd like to speak to you all briefly about another lens that we approach our work together at MIX through, not just as a community or population, or as Joel said, as a discrete set of needs that we include in our design consideration, but as one more layer of this notion of intersectionality with other identities and cultures and ways of being. And that's the lens of autism and neurodiversity. And as architects and designers, we are stewards of the built environment and the sensory inputs that come with it. So we're very interested in, but also should feel a burden of that responsibility of that sensory world that this built environment affords us all, but particularly for those along the spectrum of autism and those with neurodiverse needs. Our responsibility is ensuring that the sensory world doesn't become a barrier, but rather becomes a facilitator of access, comfort, and even, as my colleague Erin Friedlaender will tell you, a right to joy in design spaces with certain neurodiverse and autistic needs taken into consideration. So the Autism Aspects Design Index Linda talked about earlier, which we developed in 2014, works with this built sensory environment to shift the responsibility from the shoulders of the user. So rather than thinking that it is the user responsibility to conform their body to the space that we place them in, we shift that responsibility to that of the designer for us to conform the sensory world to be more accessible and adaptable to those needs. So Aspects is a framework of 7 design constructs, and it's the first set of research-based criteria to help us think about how to design more effective and accessible spaces through the lens of autism spectrum. And it calls for a predictability of space, a sequencing of spaces in a way that flows seamlessly from one activity to the next, which is very relevant when you're thinking about museum contexts. It also talks about grouping functions into high stimulation and low stimulation zones that are then separated for that seamlessness with transition spaces that allow individuals to recalibrate as they move from these different experiences and reduce the environmental stress that goes along with that motion of modulating acoustics, minimizing background noise and reverberation and echo, controlling light level intensities and color and glare, and some of the more building facilities issues that Hansel was talking about in his work. So the autistic lens really affords us an understanding of the built environment that can inform how we effectively design for that access and inclusion of this diverse perspective. And the visual tactics that are used by autistic artists, designers, and autistic bodies in space themselves, as Hansel was talking about, the cultural accommodations that deaf space culture makes to their own bodies in space to adapt to that sensory world, those adaptations are wonderful lessons and starting points to really important design tactics that we can use to make these spaces more accessible for them. So some of the examples of these visual tactics used by these artists provide these vignettes into how the sensory environment around them can be experienced, understood, and even managed better. So one example from a child who distilled his world down to only silhouettes and reflections to edit out the distractions of detail that otherwise would overwhelm and consume his sensory perception. Or the image on the top left from the wonderful work of Sean Alquist at the University of Michigan that shows the autistic body that presses itself into the mesh of a play space and molds it to their posture, injecting this kind of haptic sensibility and sensory input with the knowledge of that body's position in space that grounds them and allows them to be still and creates this really important mental space for other perceptions and other processes to come flowing in. Next slide. And interestingly, through this video, you also see through the autistic mind, the decoding of the experiences of our cities during lockdown. And it's expressed through this analytical mind of the moving image as an autistic artist contemplates the view from his window during the pandemic, where he observed the patterns of seagulls over the city over time and discovered that their flight patterns mirrors the street network of that abandoned city. And all of these are examples of what we call autistic as expert, that autism and neurodiversity brings an expertise to understanding our sensory world that is such invaluable cue to thinking about how we need to design better and better for everyone, or as Simon Baron-Cohen, the Cambridge psychologist, would say, these individuals are our pattern seekers. So we've used this work, and this neurodiverse autistic lens has helped us create autism-friendly designs at a whole bunch of different scales. Joel talked about university campuses, learning spaces, healthcare spaces, residential spaces. And we see here an example of one of those sensory strategies at Dublin City University campus. This is a campus map, and it illustrates what I call the escapescape, which is a landscape of interconnected escape spaces that works in parallel and in conjunction with a sensory pathway. So this sensory pathway is actually an infrastructure that stitches together these spaces across the entire campus. And what is most interesting about this strategy, it's designed by autistic users who shared their own spatial awarenesses and experiences of adaptation, those cultural customizations that Hansel was talking about. And from that was born the idea of the sensory pathway and the escapescape. So this student was using these narrow alternative pathways to find her way and weave her way around campus to avoid the crowds and the overstimulation. And from that concept, we built an entire network for the sensory sensitive to be able to navigate campus in a more seamless way. And this is, again, another example of that concept of autistic spatial agency and autistic as expert. And finally, just looking intersectionally across these two sets of design approaches, deaf space aspects, we see a lot of alignments and overlaps between the design standards that Hansel and I have been working on, and it continues to be a source of great inspiration and discussion amongst us of where the comparisons lie, where the alignments lie, and where the conflicts also lie between creating spaces that work for deafness and work for autism. But these are all questions that we've been exploring at MIX and in projects with new intersectional design approaches like the multisensory wayfinding strategy that I'll explain in a moment. Next slide. So as we say at MIX, when you design for the extremes of the user experience, as we just outlined, or from the margins, you can design better for everyone. And we illustrate this concept in a university case study where we developed a set of design principles informed by this type of comparative analysis of the common needs of these marginalized users, and then applied them to a recent MIXdesign commission, a ground-up residential college for an Ivy League university that houses 550 student rooms, a dining hall, library, lounge, classroom, and theater, and was the perfect kind of design laboratory for us to explore this concept of multisensory wayfinding. Next slide. So these diverse perspectives and lenses inform the development of what we call multisensory wayfinding, which is interior design principles that augment conventional signage and use color, materials, lighting, acoustics, to differentiate two kinds of legible activity zones: barrier-free circulation paths that are coded white, running horizontal across the center of this plan, and multisensory microclimates that are the oval spaces that are coded in blue in this plan. And the goal is to balance the concept of social distancing and human connectivity that Hansel talked about earlier, but in a way that minimizes the environmental stressors and increases the spatial awareness for everyone. And that is informed by the experience of the diverse user groups that we work with. Next slide. So just zooming into this solution a little bit, in the vestibule, visitors can clean at hand sanitizing stations before entering the building, and then a central planter creates a division for entry-exit one-way circulation. We provide a transition threshold that demarcates the intersection where these circulation paths cross, so all occupants of all abilities can slow down and acclimatate to the changes in direction. And this also provides a sensory transition area where everyone, including deaf and autistic users, have an opportunity to slow down and adjust their senses and recalibrate between the indoor and the outdoor experience as they enter through this entry vestibule. And this section is taken through the ground floor study lounge, which is subdivided into, again, barrier-free circulation down the middle, but these microclimates or these eddies that Hansel outlined in his Deaf Space principles. They are tactile and they create tactile and the visual datum for navigation for low vision and neurodiverse users, but also acoustical oases of these sound absorbent islands that allow for focused work and conversation for neurodiverse and autistic users, lighting that allows clarity for signers to be able to navigate without eye strain, and of course, clear mobility pathways for our wheelchair users. And all of this is in a seamless, very integrated way without segregation, without that separate but equal problem that Joel outlined at the beginning. And in this section through the comm zone, we subdivided the lounge into different multisensory zones: the barrier-free zone with color contrasting flooring and a detectable edge, and the comm zone that has semi-enclosed nooks for small group conversations and adjustable low-level lighting that reduces all this unwanted glare and stimulation for individuals either on the autism spectrum or signers that need a visually calm background to make sure that the signing is legible. And then finally, this section through the indoor-outdoor transition zone shows the exterior canopy that shades the double pane glass window and sound-absorbing interior finishes. And it speaks to the relationship between inclusive design and also that's something that's very important, building performance, thermal and acoustic comfort, and energy efficiency. Also shows us two multisensory zones. And we think of this multi-sensory wayfinding strategy as a really great way to bring together everything that MIX represents in a very tangible, discrete, legible space that can demonstrate in sort of a showcase the power of what this kind of mixing can do and mean in a context of something like a university campus. And I'll hand it back to Hansel.
Next slide, Lee. Thank you. The next project we'd like to share with you has to do with inclusive design or participatory design. In our current work at the Queens Museum, participatory design has really become an essential component of that work. For those of you who may not be familiar with the museum, it's located in a pavilion that was built in 1939 for the World's Fair in Flushing Meadows Park in Queens. In 2014, the museum hired a well-known British architect, Grimshaw, to make the building more welcoming. Grimshaw's solution was fairly typical of museum renovations at that time, really opting to create a very transparent institution. He replaced the original opaque facade you see here. This is the replacement you see here with a glass, more welcoming, transparent wall that led into a 3-story grand atrium conceived as a fairly multi-use, multi-purpose lobby in which to stage a variety of public and private events. Next. The Queens Museum, not too long after that renovation, began to grapple with the challenges of that space. And it was a common and continues to be a common kind of community or problem for community-oriented museums that have undergone these similar kind of renovations. And that is the atrium itself, this multi-purpose use space, this grand space, is a vast entry, which while it doubles and is functional as an event space, it is also inhospitable and disorienting for many of the different embodied and culturally identified multilingual users and visitors. Our project here is to use participatory design as a tool to reimagine the atrium as a flexible sequence of activity zones. And those zones may consist of entry vestibule, reception area, restrooms, and multi-purpose event space that would be operational and welcoming to the museum's local community of diverse users. This project is important to understand. It's a critical component to a larger kind of multi-dimensional initiative currently underway at the Queen's Museum, known as the Year of Uncertainty. The museum's taken on this grand initiative to strengthen its connections among the museum, its communities and constituents, and is focused on creating new possibilities for culture, kinship, and mutual support. So our contribution to that larger picture has to do with modifying the space to support that kind of new vision for the museum. Next. Our work really focused around an access cohort, and the process played out in about 4 phases that we'll kind of walk you through quickly. First, we conducted surveys and interviews and workshops to document the challenges and barriers of the marginalized users that are really facing the public users today. And to accomplish that goal, we've conducted 170 visitors and staff surveys and interviews. We've conducted over 7 participatory design workshops with the access cohort you see represented here, consisting of a group of 25 Queens residents who represent a cross-section of visitors that the museum really is seeking to attract. The cohort includes older adults, wheelchair users, individuals who use walkers, parents with young children, native Spanish speakers. There's deaf and hard of hearing folks involved. We have people with low vision, neurodiverse users, trans and non-binary people, and other marginalized community members are engaged. Next. Our first workshops were really to identify the challenges. And I think it's key to really get to a level of depth that we were able to do working on site with the access cohort. We were able to quite literally measure and document very specific design problems that we would undertake. And that was kind of our first step on site. And then next, next slide, moved on to next series of workshops, which were really about inclusion. So working with the users to take those problems they had identified and begin to take on that experience with solutions. We gave participants crayons, markers, modeling clay, scissors, and trace paper, and asked them to brainstorm and create, be it 3D models, drawings to solve that would represent ideas of solving very specific spatial challenges that were raised in their earlier groups. In the image here, you see Luis, who was a wheelchair user for entire life, who is recommending really beautiful ideas about serpentine ramps in which to move through a terraced space that would also create social spaces. The next slide, please. In some of the images also and the activities also focused on this idea of culture and creating solutions that were around expressing that diversity of the Queens Borough and really sort of signifying how the museum culturally is an open and inclusive place. So there was a lot of work and ideas literally around wayfinding that were couched in cultural expression. And that was a very interesting sort of merger between access and culture that took place during those workshops. And then the final phase, I'll let Joel take on more discussion. If you would, Joel, share what you're up to with the this semester and your class with Queens.
Yeah, thank you, Hansel. So we're now on the final stage of this project, again, which has been funded by a group of federal grants. But what I'm very, very proud of, and I want to emphasize, is that I'm now co-teaching an interdepartmental Yale seminar with a Yale public health professor, Neil Baer. And this actually builds on and consolidates what has been a kind of organic, a 3-year alliance between MIXdesign and Yale Public Health, both graduate students and faculty who have worked with us to, again, expand our purview and make us, but really make our constituencies aware that inclusive design not only is a social justice issue, but one that directly, and we have data to back it up, improve mental and physical health. So, and I should point out that we won't share it with you now, but over the years, we've worked with students and folks at the Yale, across the street from the Yale Center for British Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. And we've done a series of studies and interventions about how to make their entry sequence better meet the needs of New Haven's diverse constituency. And so now, it's 3 years later, and this course is called Story Building. And what we're doing is directly folding 2 groups of students. And I want to emphasize, this is monumental for us, okay? Because it's not just architects, but it's the first time that we're really building alliance with students in public health. So half the class is public health, half the class architects. And what they're doing is they're taking all of this data, interviews, right, and surveys and so forth and so on that Hansel described. And they're also carefully thumbing through all of those sketches, right, that the Access cohort users made. And they've divided up into 4 teams. And now they're translating those visions that were proposed not by us, but by listening to the end users, okay, into actionable proposals. Okay, and what this shows you here, we just had a midterm review at the museum. Here are the students presenting their visualizations of the cohort in the foreground's designs, and they got direct feedback from that group. Okay, and so now for the rest of the weeks of the semester, next, the students are going to refine. There'll be a final review. Everyone here, everyone meaning my colleagues will be there. The schemes will be shared in a final report that will be distributed by the Architectural League of New York based on a fund that we got from NEA. And the output of not only the students' work, but everyone's contribution to the project, and that's important, that everybody's voice is documented and seen, will be shared at a conference that will be staged, hopefully, I think, I can't guarantee, but I hope, hopefully co-sponsored with Yale. And it will also, the director is so impressed with the work that she has dedicated a gallery that will show all of this work displayed in the coming year. Okay, so I hope that you in the audience, friends and staff and colleagues at Yale Center for British Art will attend this symposium, this workshop, and we invite you to also participate in future MIXdesign activities, which include those at art museums and universities like Yale. Okay, so I think that concludes our presentation. And at this point, we want to open the session up for questions from the audience. And I think, Linda, you'll be moderating.
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Hansel and Magda and Joel, for a wonderful presentation. I don't know for how many within our listening audience, all of this may be quite new, maybe something that they didn't realize that has been in discussion for the number of years that it has been in, but certainly the amount of work that you have put in terms of your MIXdesign consortium is really beyond what one could think could have been done in such a short amount of time. When I think that the American Disabilities Act was only started in the 1990s, that's a mere 30 years ago, and how far behind we are, it's exciting and it's very moving emotionally to have people who are dedicating and taking new routes in their careers in terms of help others to be able to interface and interact with what is called the built environment. Joel, I'm glad at the beginning of your talk when you spent a bit of time talking about how what was considered, quote, normal, what was considered normative things since the bell curve was invented, and people then were either put in these different spots of being one way or another, that more and more people are writing about the fact that it is the built design of the environment, which is where the problems are, and not within the individuals for whom they have trouble navigating and negotiating the built environment. So I'm really indebted to all of you and everybody else that works with you on these projects. It's just a wonderful thing that you're doing. Question, for museums just starting to think long and hard about accessibility, how do you find a starting point? Are there simple, smart ways to start small if there are budget constraints?
All right, I guess I could answer that. Well, yes, we are. I think the project that we showed you, the Mixed Museum Initiative, and I should point out that we've worked with quite a few museums in different capacities. And when we began the Mixed Museum project, we really actually were thinking much more extensively and actually, focusing on what seemed obvious, the exhibition galleries, right? What we found is that there already is quite a lot of great work, including guidelines published by the Smithsonian, that focuses on, the apparatus of display, if you will. Again, limited to, I think, people with, for the most part, mobility issues and vision questions, which is important. So in terms of thinking smaller, we thought, what if we were to look at spaces that are not so obvious? And that's where this idea of the entry sequence came about. And it was actually Linda, you again, okay? I remember you gave us a tour of your museum, and you talked about some of the challenges that you face in such a beautiful Louis Kahn building, but in terms of multi-purpose spaces and the entry sequence and so forth and so on. Then we found the same thing with students, working on a whole course dedicated to the subject across the street at the Yale University Art Gallery. And I just want to say that, I was very proud to be part of the designer of both phases of that entry lobby, okay? And I was basically asking the students, okay, and others to critique my own work, or not my own work, but my own work of the firm, because when we did that renovation, we weren't thinking through this intersectional mindset. Okay, so I want to just emphasize here that for me, what Mix is a way for me personally to rely on colleagues, two of which are here today, to basically unlearn everything I learned and that was taught to me in schools. I went to Columbia, it could be at Yale, about what it means to be an architect, okay? And that is to be a better listener and to begin to think beyond the default end user that we unconsciously think about, that I illustrated, one who is white, able-bodied, cisgendered, and typically male. So to come back to your question, okay? So to pare down the scope of work, we learned from working with you and also the Brooklyn Museum and others, okay, that let's just focus on this what seems like a very simple, narrow problem, getting people into the front door, to a reception desk, to a public space, get them oriented, and to the bathroom. And that's where we are. So that was our way of doing it. But, okay, and then I'll shut up. Okay, each of the student proposals that we're working on have been asked to do two schemes. One we call lower impact, which are very economical, working with the cheapest things possible off the shelf, okay? And the second is something higher impact that might require more budget and actually, contractors to build. And we're going to come up with budgets for that. So in other words, everything that we do, we always think not first and foremost, but that one cannot think about this work without thinking about cost, okay? And I think one of the things we do, including talking to facilities departments like we have at Yale University itself, right? The first thing that clients rightly say is, what is this going to cost us? Do we have to do this? Okay. And when I say to them, well, first, there was a time when people felt that way about having ADA accessibility. It was considered to be a hardship. Now we realize it's just the right thing to do, okay? And I think that time will come, but it hasn't come yet. So we need enlightened clients like the British Art Center, like Yale University, like the other institutions that we work with, to say, we're committed to this. But Joel and Magda and Hansel and folks, you got to do this in two ways. One that listens and adapts your general recommendations to our particular, not only demographic audience, but also the governance structures, okay? And second, that thinks about money, okay? And that can guarantee it that we can do this in an economical way. Okay, so a long-winded answer to a very simple question.
Magda or Hansel, did you want to weigh in on this?
Sorry, I was going to add to that. Do you want to add something, Hansel?
Go ahead, Megan.
No, it's just a conversation Hansel and I were actually just having the other day about how do you measure success and impact. So the things that Joel is talking about to convince capital planning or clients to spend the money to do these accessibility initiatives, sometimes you need to demonstrate what's the gain. And I think part of our role at Mix is that we are working to identify the tangible gains of designing in this way and being more inclusive and bringing these different diverse groups together, and what are the gains to the larger population. The other thing that I think is critical in prioritizing when you have a small budget, but you still want to have impact, is the interesting thing about the biggest need is it also has the biggest impact. So for example, acoustics is a huge impactful issue with the cohorts that I work with, that Hansel works with, and that our colleague Chris Downey in the blind community works with. And because the need is so great there, a little bit goes a long way, and you can exponentially improve the experience of both the very sensitive user who is on the spectrum on the edges of hypersensitivity to acoustic, as well as the whole spectrum of hearing levels when you tweak something like acoustics. And I just want to expand on what Joel said earlier. I think a good place to start is what he said about challenging the binary and thinking more along the spectrum. So who are your users? They're not just men and women, they're a whole spectrum of users. They're not just able-bodied, non-able-bodied, there's a whole gradient of a texture of the human condition in between. It always surprises me when clients come to us and say, what should we do with the autistic cohort in particular? And I said, well, have you asked them? Start that conversation with the user first. What do you need? Partner with an autistic user moving through a museum and have them narrate that experience for you as you grow as a curator, as a director, as someone who's responsible for making this experience and improving this experience. Ask them, walk in their shoes, and it talks a little bit about the empathy question that Hansel and I go back and forth around. But I think beginning with it, expanding your definition of who your users are will help you prioritize where you would invest to have the biggest impact and make the most of your museum more accessible.
I think the only thing I would add, both of those are really great answers. The only thing I might add is one of the things I think we're starting to see is an emerging greater value being placed on diversity in society, right? So certainly there are employers who are starting to really very deliberately target a more diverse workforce. Institutions, higher ed especially, is radically increasing access to education. And some of it is out of doing good, but also some of it is a business decision. We simply need greater diversity to sustain our economy. So, you trickle down from that higher, really wonderful movement I think we're starting to see in work in sustainable inclusive development. Soon we're going to be in a place where there is currency to be funding this kind of work the way it should be. That said, there are so many simple things that can be done that really don't require any kind of cost. I think in our own experience in deaf space, simply a choice of color is different. Simply where you might locate furniture or equipment is, these are cost negative or cost neutral decisions that can be made with just simple awareness. So I think large scale, long term, I think I'm feeling very optimistic about where we're going in this realm of inclusivity. Short term, absolutely, you can do a lot of cool stuff with little money.
And just to tag on to that, Hansel, for a moment, that we always say at MIX, good design is less expensive than bad design, because when things are designed poorly, you spend so much more money adapting and assisting those users to accommodate their needs post-construction, that had you taken those needs into consideration as early as possible in the process of any renovation or any rethink you're doing of the space, it saves you money down the road in the accommodations and adaptations and technologies and assistive technologies and things you'll need to be putting in place out of ADA compliance requests and so on and so forth, that had you designed it well at the beginning, taking this broader user base into consideration, it's just a more efficient design process moving forward, and people can access your spaces independently in a way that's more cost effective from the user perspective. They don't need the assistance that they need. They don't need as much support when they can be more independent. And it just goes back to this social problem that we were talking about yesterday, Hans, the cultural model, that really no one has the right to exist in space in a way that's freer or safer or more accessible than anybody else. And we have to shift the way we think about the responsibility of the body in space to adapt, as opposed to the space to adapt to the body.
Thank you. Have you worked with faith communities or worship spaces in the Yale community?
We had a little conversation, Joel, about that.
Well, yeah, well, maybe I could begin by saying the answer is yes. Actually, we worked actually at Gallaudet on a project. I showed you the bathroom project that opened, and in that same facility was an interfaith sanctuary. And we actually were, again, retained by Gallaudet to do a kind of separate study in which we brought on some expertise in religious spaces with the goal of coming up with the design of an interfaith sanctuary. And I think we were primarily focusing on the needs of the Muslim community. But Magda, as a practicing Muslim, of course, we have in-house expertise. Do you want to talk about that?
I mean, sure. I mean, Joel reached out to me in the context of thinking about, again, certain spaces through the lens of diverse users. So as an Arab Muslim woman, I can't claim to bring theological experience from the faith, but I can claim to bring the lived experience as a Muslim woman, being in spaces where I've tried to seek a place to pray or to wash for prayer. And I was able to share those experiences with Joel. So one of the things we talked about, for example, and interestingly, this correlates with some of the work that both Hansel and I do for Deaf Space and Aspects, is the spatial sequencing. So the sequence of the event and the transition of moving from the secular space prior to prayer to the prayer space. So it can be a very small, compact space. It doesn't have to be necessarily an entire mosque or synagogue or temple sequence, but moving from the secular to the sacred has a certain code, a spatial code to it, in addition to the directionality of it, of course, towards the Ibla direction of prayer. And it's interesting because then there's this hierarchy of secularity, that you go from the very secular, profane space to the place of cleansing, to the place that transitions and then splits off to the place of prayer. And Joel and I, if you remember, we went back and forth on how does that sequence have to be linear? Can we come in from the side? And just like in a puzzle, thinking about the sequencing of those spaces. And as much as it was a very small exercise, I thought it was a very interesting one, because in looking at it and thinking about it, it had all of those principles of transition, of spatial sequencing, and of zoning that we talk about, that is informed by the neurodiverse or the deaf space experience. So that was very interesting.
I think, Magda, also, am I right, the exercise you're referring to is something that maybe people in the audience might get to see. We were invited by the Cooper Hewitt in New York, the National Design Museum, to take part in an exhibition that's going to open, I think, in May. It's called Designing for Peace, and we're doing a kind of partial, full-scale mock-up of the bathroom. And what the Cooper Hewitt invited us to do was they gave us the ground floor as a speculative study where they have traditional men's and women's rooms, and they said, not only do the bathroom, but use the bathroom, because that's our shtick, if you will, as a kind of opportunity to really treat the bathroom as a social condenser and activator that activates the event spaces around it. And our expanded version of the stalled bathroom includes a prayer space for Muslims. So that's this little space, but important space that Magda helped us with. So come see the show and see it for yourself. It opens in the end of May, I believe.
And I think what's interesting, just going back to this idea of sacred spaces and lenses, I had a very interesting conversation triggered by your questions, Joel, around that little sacred space on the project that we were working on, the Cooper project. So two perspectives, one male, one female, of the role of women in sacred space in Muslim communities. So one narrative was, well, up until the 20th century, prayer was equal and we prayed together, and then that changed and women were separated from a male perspective. And then from the female perspective, it was the segregation limits women's access to space, and actually when the mixing was happening, there wasn't the territory of space and agency over space. So it was interesting, just that conversation from a male's perspective, and both historians, by the way, that the complete opposite, that shift from a single space for both genders using equally, was perceived by both genders as completely opposite interpretations historically. So I just found that super interesting from the sacred space perspective.
And before moving on to the next question, I want to thank whoever that person is for asking the question. But I want to say something else, that the implications of religion are far-reaching beyond, let's say, the space of prayer itself. And that was really one of the very first challenges that we encountered at the beginning of the stalled bathroom project. Mm-hmm. I was asked to give a talk, I think it was at Columbia, and I was so proud, that we had come up with this universal space. And a Muslim student in the audience said, well, Mr. Sanders, this is not bad, but it won't work for a woman like me. Muslim, ablution, not hand washing, but cleansing practices does not allow us to expose anything but limited body parts with members of the opposite sex. So this is not only true, we've learned, for Muslim women, but also for Orthodox Jewish women. So in other words, so I would just say that, again, we need to think much more broadly about all of the spaces we design, even workplaces, to make them meet the needs of different religious and ethnic communities and practices and religions.
Well, may I say amen to that? I'm sorry we've run out of time, but there certainly are, you've given people lots to think about. Our audience, clearly people who came in with questions, have already thought about this a lot. You've been inspiring, and thank you for the work that all of you have done. And this will not be the last conversation amongst us. So Magda and Hansel and Joel, thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your wonderful attitudes. And thank you all for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for making
Linda.
it happen.
Okay.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank you. See you in person next.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.